It's 11 o'clock. Today's March 18th, 2021. This is a meeting of the Assembly Enterprise Utility Oversight Committee. And today we have a pretty packed agenda. We're set to go for an hour and a half, which is a little bit longer than our usual duration. Ms. Camacho, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Would you please take the roll?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Ms. Allard. Mr. Constant.
Here.
Mr. Dunbar.
Here.
Ms. Kennedy.
Here.
Ms. LaFrance. Mr. Presberdilla. Mr. Peterson.
Present.
Mr. Rivera.
Present.
Mr. Weddleton. And Ms. Zalatel.
Here.
You have a quorum.
All right, thank you. Today we have an agenda before us that covers a report from the Clutna Hydroelectric Project from Chugach Electric, with a little bonus on the side of conversation about Texas and Alaska. We're going to discuss plan of finance for solid waste services, and then any new business that might be proposed. We're going to have a brief update about the stormwater utility. Any additions to the agenda? Hearing none, let's go ahead and move on. Ms. Haskett, I would like to welcome you to the committee to make your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks. We're very happy to be here. As you know, this is part of the Clutna Project Team's quarterly update to the Enterprise Committee. We're very happy that we're able to schedule these. So we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Samantha Owen, who's going to make the presentation. I also have Brian Hickey here, the COO from Chugach, Joy Huntington, who works with us on some stakeholder outreach, and I know some of the other folks involved in the team are on. I saw Anna Henderson and Tony Zellers, and I can't see everyone in the participants, but any folks that you might need questions of, I believe, are here. But Samantha's going to do the primary presentation, and then we'll take your questions. And again, this is our quarterly update on what we've been doing since the last time we talked to you.
And before we dive in, I would just read the note here briefly that Ms. Camacho just put in the chat, that please note that the chat's not part of the recording. So if you put something in the chat, we'll read it into the record, but please do note in the chat if you have a question or comment. So I'll call on you. Thank you, Ms. Owen.
All right, I'm going to try and share my screen. So you guys just tell me when you can see that.
We can see it.
Perfect. Okay, so Julie has told me that I have a strict 10-minute limit, so I'm going to just go ahead and dive right in. Last time we were with you guys was in October, so we're providing an update on basically everything that we've been doing since October, which is going to include study planning with the technical work group, other stakeholder coordination, permitting, and then preparing for our summer fieldwork season this year. And then we'll have opportunity for questions and question and answer. So this is to give you just a little bit of context about some of the stuff we're going to be talking about here in this presentation. And as a reminder for those who don't read the 1991 Fish and Wildlife Agreement as often as I do, it has some very specific requirements regarding consultation and the study plans. So it states that the study plans shall be developed in consultation with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Fish and Game, and Department of Environmental Conservation. It also states that the parties shall review the study plans and concur with their scope of work. So there's a small distinction here. The parties is technically U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the state of Alaska. So that'll be important to remember here in just a little bit. And then later in the agreement, it states that study plans shall include a schedule, which shall be adopted by the parties in consultation with the governor. So quick note, we've gotten confirmation from AEA, the Alaska Energy Authority, that they are going to be the governor's representative for the Clutna project. So when we have to do any kind of consultation with the governor, that will be through AEA. And again, and we've got some little reminders down here for you that the parties equals the owners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, and the state. And then when we talk about the technical work group, we're talking about the project owners, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, National Marine Fisheries Service, Fish and Game, the native village of Eklutna, Trout Unlimited, and staff from the Alaska Pacific University. So for study plans, last time we were talking to you guys, we were right in the middle of drafting our study plans. Those draft study plans went out to the technical work group on October 26th. They had about a month to review and comment. The comment deadline was November 25th. We received comments from pretty much everybody in the technical work group. And then we had a couple meetings with the technical work group in November and December to review their comments, discuss them, and address them. As you know, the majority of our studies this coming year are going to be very aquatics related. However, we are proposing some more infrastructure related studies, and we felt it was appropriate to reach out to those more infrastructure related agencies to give them an opportunity to review and comment on those study plans. So that included state parks, Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility, Department of Transportation, and the railroad. And we reached out to them and I believe it was October and November, December, and we received comments back from both state parks and AWU. So based on all the comments received, we revised our study plans and then distributed the revised draft study plans to the technical work group in January. We had a meeting with the technical work group to review the major revisions to the study plans, point out what changed from the draft, and then answer any clarifying questions that the technical work group may have had in advance of the comment deadline on January 29th. And we received fewer comments, but we still received some comments from the National Marine Fisheries Service, Fish and Game, Trout Unlimited, and again, staff from Alaska Pacific University. Well, we always try to put pictures in our presentations, but unfortunately, we haven't been out in the field doing any fun field work over the winter, so the only pictures I have to show you are screenshots of Zoom meetings, and I think my eyes are even closed in this picture, so we'll skip right past this one. But then again, based on the comments received, we revised the study plans, and then now we're at the proposed final study plans. So again, if you remember, the 1991 agreement requires that the parties review the study plans and concur on their scope of work. So we distributed the proposed final study plans to the parties on February 24th for their review and concurrence. And then if you also remember, technically the state is listed as the party to the as the party to the agreement. So when we started thinking about what does it mean for the state of Alaska to concur on the scope of work in the study plans, we thought it would just be better for the state agencies themselves to answer that question. And so we had a meeting amongst those state agencies on February 25th, and ultimately the state agencies determined that it would be most appropriate for the commissioner from each agency, you can see them listed there, would concur. And then we would take those concurrence letters or letter and route them up through AEA as the governor's representative to complete that additional consultation step that's required by the agreement. And so that's kind of where we sit right now. Is again, those proposed final study plans are with the parties for their review and concurrence, and we're waiting to get those concurrence letters back at this point. For other stakeholder consultation, again, we have a very broad stakeholder group outside of just the parties or even the technical work group, and we want to make sure everyone who wants to know what's going on with this project has that information readily available to them. So we actually developed a newsletter that we're going to be issuing quarterly, and it's available on the project website for people who want to download it. And then we also are going to be distributing it via email, and we issued that first newsletter in December. I think our next newsletter is coming out either later this month or maybe early next month. I'm not 100% sure on the timing of that. And then also upon request, we had a meeting with the Watershed and Natural Resources Advisory Commission on January 27th to provide them an update on our efforts to date. We had our last quarterly update call with the broader stakeholder group on January 28th, and then we've had continued coordination with the native village of Eklutna specifically. And again, here's another screenshot from one of our Zoom calls. This is the quarterly update call in January. So now that we have our study plans that are almost finalized at this point, we've started our permitting process. And so we're currently coordinating with all the appropriate agencies to obtain the necessary permits and authorizations. Two of the main ones are including Department of Fish and Game. We're getting our fish habitat permits for the string gauges and scour monitors that we're going to be installing, especially in the anadromous reaches of the lower river, fish resource permits for the fish sampling that we're going to be doing, and then a permit for the macroinvertebrate sampling we're going to be doing. And then with the Department of Natural Resources, obviously the majority of our work is going to be taking place within the state park because the project itself is located within the state park. And so we're getting a land use authorization from them in order to do our studies. And we're also coordinating with DNR to get a temporary water use authorization for the proposed study flow releases this fall. And we're also going to be coordinating with their dam safety office to do just a very general dam safety review. Some other permits that we're currently obtaining include a nationwide permit from the Army Corps for the rock and debris removal that's happening near the spillway. BLM, Bureau of Land Management, owns some relatively small parcels in the upper river, and so for any work occurring on their land, we're getting a land use authorization. Obviously, Eklutna Inc. is the primary landowner in the entire Eklutna area, and so we've been coordinating with them for an access permit to access the river. And we'll be using AWU's access road to access the upper river. So that's been some ongoing coordination. They've been very helpful with that thus far. One other step that we're doing with the parties to the agreement. So some of you might remember that there's some funky language in Section 7 of the agreement that basically says, and I'm summarizing, you can't change operations of the project until you go through the process required by the agreement, which includes conducting studies and developing the Fish and Wildlife Program. But in order to conduct our studies, we need to change the operations of the project in order to put flows down the river. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. And we see this more as a box checking exercise, but we're going to be touching base with all the parties to the agreement to make sure that they do not feel that by doing these study flow releases, we're in some way violating Section 7 of the agreement. And then also by intentionally putting water down the river that could impact downstream landowners. We're proposing relatively small flow releases this year. And when I say relatively small, I mean up to 150 CFS. We don't anticipate any impacts at all to downstream landowners or property owners, but we're going to be checking some legal boxes there with liability waivers and whatnot. This is our pretty standard schedule for our summer field work. I'm not going to go through each of these line by line. But the main takeaway here is that we're going to be doing a lot of stuff in the Eklutna area between about May and October, and generally. So this figure is available in the proposed final study plans, which is on the project website. And then I think you guys probably also have a copy of this presentation if you want to dig into this further. This will be finalized and refined as we get some logistics figured out. But in general, this is kind of what we're going to be doing out in the field this summer. And then regarding next steps, again, like I said, we're just waiting to receive those concurrence letters from the parties to the agreement, both the federal agencies and the state agencies. And then once we receive those, we'll be submitting the proposed final study plans with the state agency concurrence letters to AEA and obtain their feedback as the governor's representative. If we do receive any kind of substantive feedback, we'll of course circle back with the parties and the technical work group as appropriate. And finalize the study plans, and then we're going to continue to obtain the necessary permits and authorizations that are needed for our field work. And then we're obviously going to be implementing our study plans and conducting that field work this summer, again from about May to October timeframe. And so after about October, we're going to be transitioning into more of the study reporting. And then we're also going to go through another round of study planning for the studies that we have planned for year 2 or next year. And that's it. That's my brief update. I think I kept it to 10 minutes. So if you guys have any questions, again, I'm happy to answer them. And I think we have just about anyone and everyone on the phone from our project team should be able to answer your questions for you today.
Thank you. I would note for the record that before Ms. Owen's presentation started, Ms. LaFrance joined us. And also I see a question from Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Owen, could you describe again sort of physically how the water is released? What will that actually look like, and how often are you going to release it this summer, and how much do you plan to release?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So we are planning to, because of the way the reservoir is operated, the timing of the flow releases is generally going to be around the September time this year. It might happen a little earlier in August. It might happen a little later in October, just depending on what kind of water year we end up having. But we're generally going to be shooting for that September timeframe. And we're going to be releasing 150 CFS and then 75 CFS and then 25 CFS. The 150 CFS is going to last for, first it's going to be released for about 7 days, and that will solely be for channel stabilization, because I think a lot of us know that there's a lot of very dynamic sediment in the river downstream, and so we're hoping to be able to stabilize the channel as much as possible with that 7-day release of 150 CFS before we start our data collection. And then we'll continue to release water at 150 CFS for another 7 days. And this will be so that we can actually get out in the field and collect data. And then immediately following that will be 7 days of 75 and 7 days of 25. How we're going to release the water, there is a 30 by 30 inch drainage gate that's located in the base of the spillway. And it was originally designed when the project was built by the federal government to drain the pond that exists kind of on the upstream side of the dam. For those who aren't super familiar with the area, old storage dams in that area used to be located right at the lake outlet. And then after the 1964 earthquake, the dam that existed at that time was kind of damaged beyond repair. And so the federal government decided to just build a brand new dam about 1,400 feet downstream. And that dam was built in 1965. But what ends up happening is that when the lake level drops below about 860, which is the crest of the glacial moraine at the lake outlet, a pond forms right there, kind of 1,400 foot long pond. And so there was some original worries that during winter there would be some ice freeze effect on the dam with that pond, and so they put this drainage outlet in there in order to drain the pond before winter. However, it's never actually been used that way, and the freeze there haven't been any freeze thaw damages to the concrete spillway or the dam itself. So that gate has kind of just been sitting underwater for about 65 years without really being fully operated. We did we tried to do a condition assessment of the gate in August, and we found out that there was basically a giant pile of rocks and debris sitting in front of the gate, and so we couldn't look at it. We threw an underwater ROV down there and tried to get some underwater pictures of it, and that's how we found the giant pile of rocks. And so what we're going to be doing this spring, actually one of the very first things we're going to be doing in the field this spring is we're going to get some divers out there to remove all the rocks, and then we're going to conduct a condition assessment of that gate, figure out, what needs to be done to repair the gate in order to get it ready for flow releases this fall. But the flow releases will be going through that 30 by 30 gate, and it's rated to release up to 190 CFS, but that's when the lake is literally at the spillway crest. So our proposed high flow of 150 CFS is us trying to be a little conservative in the fact that we don't necessarily want to get the water all the way to the spillway crest, because we don't want an uncontrolled release of water over the spillway. But we've accounted for the fact that we're going to shoot for 150, but if we can, we'll maybe do 170 or 175, as high as we can go, as high as basically nature will allow us at that time. And so with that high flow of 150, we'll be able to calibrate our PHAB-SEM model, which is basically the fish habitat model we're going to be creating up to, now I have to remember off the top of my head, I think it's 375 CFS. And then we'll be able to calibrate our HEC-RAS model up to about 1,000 CFS. And then we've proposed some potentially additional flows next year to calibrate that further if needed. I probably rambled too much there, but I hope that answers your question.
No, it does. That's great. I have a quick follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I'm glad to hear that all makes a lot of sense, given I think a lot of us have spent time out there and seen it. I was sort of under the impression that the spillway gate was non-functional, but it sounds like we just don't know yet, and you guys are doing the necessary work to get us there, which is great. I guess what I don't understand, or so am I to understand then that when you release that water, it's not just releasing water from that pond, that there is some mechanism to have water go from the lake to the pond and then through the spillway? Because I was under the impression that water very rarely escaped from the lake into the pond, or is there some way to facilitate that?
So that's kind of why we're shooting for September. And let me explain that a little further, is because the lake and the pond are actually generally connected for about 3 months out of the year. And that's from about mid-August to about mid-October, or maybe November is what it is. And so that's based on our approximation that glacial moraine is at about 860. And so there's a USGS gauge in the lake by the project intake, and looking at the past 20 some odd years of data, the lake actually gets to about 865 on average. Sometimes it's a little less, sometimes it's a little more, but on like a very average year, the pond and the lake are connected for about 3 months out of the year. So we're going to be timing our flow releases to occur when the pond and the lake are connected, so that we don't just drain the pond in 7 hours and then we run out of water, right? So.
Understood. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Cool.
All right. Are there other questions relating to this project? Okay, hearing none. Let's move on to topic number 2. I had asked informally to have Chugach Electric give us a briefing on the topic of the electric grid and our resiliency and vulnerability in relationship to what happened in Texas in January, I think it was, about a month ago, a little bit more. And previously, we had Mr. Hickey do an amazing article with Alaska Public Media, to which I'm going to put the link into the chat, and maybe Desiree, you can put that up on the website for people. And that story really talked about the technical issues relating to our grid and how it's similar and different in the risks that we face, and relative to Texas's experience. And I think my big takeaway was we are not vulnerable in the same way Texas is, because they're vulnerable to cold, but we are vulnerable to heat in a climate changing world. And so my question, and I hope this was communicated to you in advance, Brian, if not, it'll be roundabout, is from a financial perspective, we as a municipality that's a big customer now of an electric utility, and all of us who are customers of an electric utility from Ketchikan all the way up to Fairbanks, even though we're not all connected, are interrelated and have risk. And my big question is there a scenario where we could find ourselves as a city owing $100 million for 10 hours of power, similar to some municipalities in Texas? And if so, what do we have to do to help you, to help the state and the whole power grid to come to grips with that potential? And what's our fate if we don't do anything? Big question.
Well, thank you, Chairman Constant. I guess the short answer is no. That's not something we really need to worry about here in Alaska. And I'll give you a little background as to why. From a financial perspective, and I'll leave the issues around reliability and resiliency planning. If you listen to that link, I think we covered it pretty well there. And it basically explains, how all that works and where we are. And I don't think we have issues around cold weather contingencies, but we are looking now with greater clarity, I'm trying to think. I'm looking at what 120-degree summer would look like in Anchorage and in the municipality, and how that would affect us. So we have some idea of where we're exposed on the warm side, because here we plan for cold weather, down there they plan for warm weather. We plan for 70 and 80-degree summers, but if we had a summer with continuous temperatures above 100 degrees, it would be a very freak experience for us, but it could cause us problems. So we're looking at that on the resiliency side, and we'll have more information on that. We'll understand that better within the coming year. But putting that aside, if you go to the financial side, the issue in Texas is, and a vast difference between the Rail Belt region, which includes the municipality of Anchorage, and the Texas grid is the way we settle, the term we use is settle the economics of transactions. And in the Rail Belt, we are all cost-based entities. We're co-ops and munis, municipals, we call them. And so the way we make our rates is based on our costs. And so whatever we spend, for a co-op, we're what we call tier regulated. So we get a markup on the interest on our long-term debt, and that's what we get to collect from our customers, and that's all. So it's very cost-based here. The Texas grid is very different, and the way they actually settle the economics is through a complex market structure. And they have a market which I would equate sort of to the Chicago Mercantile. It's a commodities exchange market, and they trade power as a commodity. What's very unique about the Texas grid compared to the other regional grids in the lower 48 is that it is an energy-only market. And it's a very free market concept. They said, we're not going to pay anyone to have any capacity standing by. We're only going to pay you for energy when you're running. And the way they try to generate interest in building capacity is through these very high market prices during times of scarcity. We have nothing like that in Alaska. We are strictly cost-based. So if the gas costs $7.48 per 1,000 cubic feet, that's what the customer pays. It passes right through one for one. So what happens in the Texas market is during times of scarcity, they try to raise the price, and they have a ceiling of $9,000 a megawatt. And the idea of that market price was, historically, they tried to use that to drive people to build gas turbines and stuff. It's been a challenge for Texas going back. I've been kind of following that grid for probably a decade. And there has been a lot of back and forth as to whether they should create a capacity market down there. If you were in the PJM interconnection or New England ISO or California ISO, they have specific capacity markets where they pay people to build stuff. But in Texas, they use this price to try to signal it through a free market mechanism. And what happened during my understanding, and I don't have any particular insight, I have spoken to a friend of mine who worked there, but I don't have any in-depth insight into what happened. My understanding was the market price was hovering around $1,200 a megawatt hour. They weren't getting enough generation to meet load. So the PUC said, run it up to the 9,000 and see if we can get people to start their turbines. Well, that went on for 4 days, and they still didn't have enough because they just didn't have enough capacity for that contingency. And so you had this huge price spike, and it's sort of the typical kind of thing that occurs when, markets work well when they're heavily traded, and there's a randomicity to the whole thing. But when everybody rushes to one side of the boat, markets don't work very well. And this is one of those instances where everybody went to one side of the boat and the price went to the top. But it's not something that we don't even have that mechanism in the state of Alaska. So short answer is we have no worries on the financial side. And on the resiliency side, like I said, we're looking into, what are the potentials for very, very warm summers in Alaska? We don't have those answers yet, but we plan for 90-degree summers. So it's not likely that we're going to have an extended duration of 100 or 110 degrees. But if we did, we're going to look at what those outcomes are. So I don't know if I answered your question.
You absolutely did. If I might summarize and take away, then the answer is we are now, because of the changing climate in business and in the climate, we are looking at the resiliency question. What happens in high temperature environments, extended high temperature environments? And from a fiscal perspective, we're protected because the cooperative structure and the state regulatory schemes don't provide for huge spikes in cost based on market demand, only based on the price of the goods themselves.
That's exactly right.
That's a message that the public needs to hear, because I've had that question asked a lot, is can this happen here? And your answer on the radio was awesome because it gave the technical answer really well. And this answer, I think, is the partner to that. So thank you very much. Is there any other comments or questions from the committee to the presenters? I'm hearing none. That puts us at half an hour in, which gives us time to dive into the other important business. So thank you all for making this presentation. We look forward to seeing you again in a quarter, hearing any updates you might have. And if you have anything, just send it our way.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. We appreciate it.
Yep, thank you. And next, I believe we're going to turn to Mr. Spafford. Solid Waste Services to discuss the plan of finance. Mr. Spafford, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. I'm gonna share my screen and get our presentation kicked off.
All right, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity to be able to update the committee on our master plan, our plan of finance, and our investment, our ARL closure and post-closure care investment fund, and some of the proposed assembly actions that you all are going to be seeing here in the very near future. So I'm going to talk about real briefly our 5-year capital improvement plan, just update or remind everybody what's included in that. It includes some stuff out of the climate action plan. I'll have Mr. Slivka be talking about the some changes that we're going to make to the language associated with the ARL closure and investment fund. He'll also talk, or we'll both talk about proposed assembly actions. We'll have our my chief financial officer Heidi talk about utility rates and give everybody a history about where we're at with those. And again, we'll come back again to the ordinances and resolutions that you guys are going to be seeing here next week, and answer any questions that you might have. So just to give everybody an update about the major projects that are a reminder, not really an update, but the major projects that are included in the integrated solid waste master plan that we completed in 2018 and subsequently updated, I think, late 2019, early 2020. Obviously, the big one is the new central transfer station, which is ongoing in construction right now. Another big part of that is the repurposing of the existing transfer station site to the new Anchorage Recycling Center. So that's where we're going to be doing the majority of the diversion and those activities, that I've been talking about for the past few years that are going to help to extend the life of the landfill, another 20 to 30 years out. A couple of the other big projects that are associated, $5-10 million projects that are in the master plan that are going to be done over the next 5 to 10 years, is construction of the 2 final cells at the Anchorage Regional Landfill. So we completed a cell this year, and we have 2 more left. And so basically what that means in a nutshell is that once we finish those last 2 cells over the next 5 to 10 years, essentially the entire bottom of the 200 plus acres of the Anchorage Regional Landfill are going to have liner. And what we're going to be doing from that point forward is basically building up and building the mountain of trash, that you guys see when you drive past it on the Glen Highway. And another really important project, and kind of like the last big project that's associated with our capital improvement plan, as well as the climate action plan, is the leachate treatment and disposal system. And that's important for a couple of reasons, which I'll get into on the next slide. But basically, we're looking at a total project cost between the transfer station, the recycling center, remaining cell construction, and the leachate pre-treatment and disposal system improvements of $165 million. About $10 million that's going to be required for that $165 million financing that we're going to ask for is going to be associated with, required reserves that we need and expenses that are related to taking on that debt. To bring us to a total of $175 million for the improvements that are associated with the master plan. And so to give you guys kind of an idea about what cell construction looks like, it's actually pretty cool. It only happens every 5 years. What you're looking at right there is about 15 acres of the bottom of the Anchorage Regional Landfill, and to the left is where we have existing trash. And if you look, that black stuff that you see right beneath the beautiful mountains there, that's the actual plastic liner that separates the environment from all the garbage that we're putting on top of that. So again, it's a pretty cool project. Again, that's about 15 acres, just to kind of give you some scale about, how big and how large the Anchorage Regional Landfill is. So kind of the important project that we're going to be talking about today that you may or may not be totally familiar with is the leachate pretreatment and disposal project that we have going on. We're kicking off the project next week. The Assembly approved the design contract with Tetra Tech and Dow a couple meetings ago. But basically, every year we haul approximately 30 to 40 million gallons of leachate from the landfill down the Glen Highway to the Turpin dump station that's right at, Boniface and the Glen, every year. That gets discharged into into AWU's wastewater collection system. And so what that represents is approximately 4,000, round trips by an SWS tractor with a 6,000 gallon tank of leachate. Every year, there's not a year that goes by since I started working here about 5 years ago that there aren't at least several accidents or incidents that occur between our transfer tractors and other vehicles that either slide into it into the winter. I think last year we had somebody that was running from the police that ran into, one of our leachate tankers, and thank God, we had just changed the design of where the drains on those was located, because if we would have had one of the old designs, we would have dumped 6,000 gallons of leachate, right in the middle of the Boniface and Turpin intersection there. So that wouldn't have been good. So what we're trying to do, the main point of that project is to get those trucks off the road and minimize the amount of vehicles that we have going up and down the highway. Because if you guys remember, one of the largest contributors to greenhouse gases in this community is transportation. And obviously 4,000 round trips from our transfer tractors going down the road every year represents a large amount of greenhouse gases that are being emitted into the atmosphere because of that activity. So what we're looking at doing is evaluating leachate evaporators. And basically what a leachate evaporator is it is exactly what it is. It's, you put leachate into it, it heats up the liquid that's in the chamber of the unit itself, it evaporates it, and thus reduces the amount, the volume of material that you have to either truck or do something with at some point down the road. And so I remember when I started, Mr. Trainey, Dick Trainey, used to beat me up, I think, at every meeting that I ever saw him at, and ask me, what are we doing with all the excess landfill gas that we have that we're currently just flaring? Because as you know, we capture about 3,000 standard cubic feet per minute of gas coming off of the Anchorage Regional Landfill. About half of that goes to our waste to energy project that we have with Doyon Utilities, that of course powers about half of the Fort Richardson side of J-Bear. But basically what we're doing now is the other half of the gas we don't have a beneficial use for, so we have to essentially flare it to meet our air quality and our air permit requirements. But what we're going to be able to do with these leachate evaporators is we're going to be able to utilize that valuable resource, that methane that we're collecting off of the landfill, and being able to use it to basically fuel the evaporator that's going to help us to significantly reduce the amount of leachate that we're going to have to haul. And so why this is important is, again, because we want to get as many of those tractors as we can off of the road. We want to reduce the greenhouse gas footprint that we have that's associated with those. Implementing the leachate evaporators and getting those trucks off the road was one of the main goals from the solid waste section of the Climate Action Plan that, of course, was passed a few years ago. And another big one that you heard Mr. Corsentino talk about it a couple months ago is helping AWU to maintain compliance with their 301H discharge permit. And if you guys remember, that 301H discharge permit is basically what Anchorage has as an exemption to keep us from having to go to secondary treatment and keep the primary treatment that we have right now. And so leachate is the largest industrial pollutant contributor to the wastewater collection system here in Anchorage. And as Corsentino, I'm sure will tell you, anything that we can do to minimize the amount of that pollutant going to his system, the better it's going to make their case with continuing the waiver that they have with their 301H discharge permit. And so those are kind of the environmental and cost benefits that are associated with getting leachate off the road and stop having to truck it.
Mark,
so this is
Mark, before you move on, there's a question from Mr. Dunbar on that last slide.
Thank you, Mark. And this is, I don't think necessarily, well, let me just ask the question. So do you pay AWU to discharge that? Do you give them some kind of, I guess not even inter-fund transfer or whatever it's called. It's because you're different enterprises. But will AWU be losing revenue if you stop dumping this in there?
Yes. Okay. And that's one of the cost benefits for SWS is that, the less that we discharge to AWU, the less that obviously those fees are going to be. And obviously the more trucks that we can take off the road, the less employees that we have to pay to do that. That means that we can have those employees working on other things at the landfill, like the gas collection system, which we obviously need, to put as much time into that as possible. We have to buy less vehicles, we have to use less fuel. But yeah, to answer your question really quickly, Forrest, is AWU is going to lose some revenue.
So that's interesting. It's an interesting point. They're going to lose revenue, but then of course that's revenue coming from you. So it's sort of a Peter and Paul thing here. I would guess, perhaps I'm wrong, is this a large enough source of revenue for AWU to make a significant hole in their budget, or is it relatively small compared to their total budget? Do you know?
I think I know that we pay a bulk rate that's pretty cheap. It's like, I think we pay the same rate that the septic haulers pay. So it's not necessarily a lot of money that AWU is going to be missing out on. And Corsentino can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think the impact relative to, the revenues that they get on their wastewater side of the house, it's going to be that big of an impact.
Okay. Yeah, it's not, Forrest. It's material, it's notable, but it's not going to, the bigger concern we'd have is if we continue to take it, our cost could increase much larger because of the fact of our 301H permit. And the cost estimate to upgrade that is in that $1 billion range. And right. So I'd rather lose that revenue, which it's notable. It's not going to, it would just reduce our net income, and it would honestly spread the cost to other customers, but not in a notable manner that they would see it so much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And that was Mr. Corsentino for the record. So, okay, now we can proceed on. Unless, Meg, do you want to ask your question now or wait? Ms. Altel?
I'd like to wait to the end, please.
All right. Yep, thanks. You're still in the queue.
Okay, so there's a cool picture of the evaporator and what it might look like. And again, like I said, we're starting the design process and evaluation of different options for pre-treatment of leachate and disposal of leachate, next week. So we're super excited about that. And then next, I guess I'll turn it over to Mr. Slivka, and he can walk you through some of the stuff that's going on with the aerial closure and post-closure investment fund.
Thank you, Mr. Spafford, and yes, page 9. So just as a reminder, what you're seeing today is several years worth of collaboration between solid waste, the MOA finance team, and AWU in terms of figuring out how we could accomplish the projects that needed to get done and utilize what resources were available. What you're going to hear through all of this is that through the course of these discussions, we were able to identify some changes that is allowing solid waste to bring forward to the present projects that they were planning to do 4 or 5 years out because they didn't have the money. And so now we have found them some money, and they can proceed with projects that are critical to upgrading the infrastructure, and as Mr. Spafford said, meet our goals in the climate action plan. So just as a reminder, the post-closure fund was set up in 2016, funded in 2017. The purpose, as mandated by the EPA, is to set aside monies so that once the landfill is closed, it can be maintained and monitored in a post-closure manner. as a reminder of the importance of this, we are today, ratepayers are paying for the upkeep to Merrill Field and other past landfills that are no longer in use because resources were not set aside in a timely manner to pay for those. The closure post-closure fund is dictated by code, and what we're submitting is a revision to that code, and is well managed by a 5-member board currently chaired by Jeff Sins, who in his prior life held my position. Over the past year, we hired an external consultant to build a closure model, and they created a model, and through utilizing forecasting, both in terms of the liability as well as terms of the assets and growth of the assets, the model indicated that we could pull as much as $26 million out of the closure post-closure fund and utilize those funds for capital projects, and this is what we're going to be recommending. Next slide, Mark. Or maybe Crystal, do you have a question on this slide?
Yeah, go ahead, Ms. Kennedy.
Actually, it's more on the evaporation system. So if you want to get through with the financial part, we can come back to my questions.
Okay, so we have Ms. Zalatil in the queue then, and then you.
Okay. So this kind of indicates what's going to happen. We have $41 million in this fund right now, and the way the code currently reads, we wouldn't have to put any money into it at all for the next 40 years. So what that really means is every client of solid waste up until today has paid for the entire cost of closure and post-closure, and all the clients for the next 40 years would pay nothing. And that just isn't in alignment with what we believe is cost causer, cost payer, which is our approach to how we manage most of our enterprises and utilities. So what this demonstrates to you is what will happen over time, where we'll have a starting balance somewhere in the $17 million range. We'll be making deposits into it, and it will earn income. And what you're seeing is that the dark line is the liability, and the purple mountain is the amount of investments. It's not really cash, it's investments over time. And what happens is at maturity, and when these payments need to be made, the money is there. So it is the most efficient use of solid waste resources, and is most beneficial to solid waste ratepayers. Mark, you want to go to the next slide?
Before you move on,
sure.
A couple of questions for myself. The amount available for closure, is that what's that based on? And do we have it based on a net present value and a projection, so we understand the difference of money then versus today? And then the second question is, you briefly listed out that one of the proposals is going to be capital projects. I assume you're going to detail that out for us, or is that to come later? I don't want to ask too early the question, of course, where would those be? You know, what would the purpose of those projects be? So
the capital projects were the ones that Mark detailed. And Mark, do you want to flip back up to that first page and we can just point at them briefly?
No, okay, that's right. I get it.
So what we're doing is we're bringing forward the cell construction and the leachate improvement, things that we would not otherwise have happened because they didn't have the resources. So we're just building today what has already been approved within the capital plan.
Okay, I just wanted to connect the dots there. And then the question of the relative value of the dollars in the fund compared to what they would be in 2096 or some far away
Mark,
place.
you want to go back to the mountain slide? So again, HDR was contracted to do a liability study. The net present value as of today of closure would be 59 million, post-closure would be 39 million. So that's 100 million in today's dollars. And so what this model describes is over the next, what is the total I'm not sure if I can get to the total outlay, but what I can tell you is that the total cost involved is approaching $500 million. In other words, we're going to, over time, and Mark, do you want to go to the next slide? So over time, we're going to be depositing money, and on a per ton basis, this works out to a couple dollars a ton. It doesn't change the amount that people are being charged at all. But over time, solid waste is going to deposit roughly $100 million, and those funds are going to earn roughly $400 million. And together, that's going to allow us to satisfy the liability as detailed on the previous slide.
Okay, thank you.
Mark, want to go to the next slide? So this is what's going to come before you. These will be put in for the addendum to be introduced on the 23rd and then for hearing on April 13th. We're going to change the code so that it more correctly aligns with what we're proposing to do. That'll be one ordinance. The resolution will ask for an amount not to exceed $26 million to be taken from the investment fund and put into solid waste for their capital projects. And the other ordinance is just going to revise and update the capital plan and ask for authority to borrow some additional money. Next slide. So why are we doing this? We think we've talked about it before. As Mr. Spafford said, we are able to move forward to the present major capital projects that are critical. I mean, you heard Mr. Corsentino talk about it. If we can reduce significantly the amount of leachate that flows into the AWU system, that further enhances the opportunity that they do not have to spend $1 billion to go to secondary treatment. You've heard Mr. Corsentino talk about it. This is this EPA 301H permit. We believe that these projects will be very beneficial towards trying to avoid spending additional money toward that. In terms of rates, we've been talking for many years, that that solid waste for many years, rates were not raised at all, even though inflation continued and cost continued. And as Mr. Spafford has said, the transfer station got run down. A lot of their facilities are run down. And so we have been instituting a series of rate increases every year. This proposal, we believe, will allow us to stay within that schedule. The opposite, of course, is if we don't go forward with this withdrawal, then we will have to borrow additional money, and then rates would increase well above what the current rates proposals are. We really believe that this is the best use of available funds. Solid waste does not have a lot of cash lying around, so some of this would allow them to meet rating requirements as we go to the capital markets to have 90 days worth of cash on hand. This is just a requirement in order to maintain a single A rating, which is what they will most likely get when we go to the market to borrow money. And overall, going to the public market is really the most efficient source of funds. Even though interest rates have risen a little bit here recently, they are still historically low. And another advantage of going forward with this now is that we're able to complete these projects and borrow the money at historically low interest rates. And obviously, using this ARL fund reduces the amount of debt we would have to incur. And these are all achieved if we pass the three actions that are going to be in front of you. I think I stopped there and see if there are any questions.
Are there any questions from the members on this presentation? So nobody's speaking up. I would just add one note, Mr. Slivka and Mr. Spafford, that it's anticipated that an infrastructure bill is going to be moving through the Congress, and that if that project lands, then there will be substantial funding available for, going back to that old hackneyed phrase, shovel-ready projects. And clearly, resiliency and climate change and coming up with better ways of moving waste is an important infrastructure aspect. And so I just want to make sure that you have in the back of your heads and on a side table of a spreadsheet are starting to build a list of potential projects, even some of these that might fit within that rubric. Now I have questions. We'll start with Miss Kennedy. She was in the queue. And then we'll go to Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. I have a question in regard to the evaporation system, the leachate evaporation system, and that is, well, actually 2 questions. First of all, it is supposed, I guess it's intended to reduce gas emissions. So I'm just wondering how that works when you're actually burning more material. It seems to me it would maybe actually contribute to more gas emissions. But so you can kind of fill me in on what the science or the detail is about that. And then the second question has to do with, you know, I have a community out there near the landfill that already complains about the smell from the methane that's burned off. So how will the odor be improved, or will it be worse, or has there been any investigation on that? Thanks.
So great questions. So how the overall greenhouse gas emissions are going to be reduced is basically the evaporator functions the same as the flare. So right now, like I said, half the gas goes to the Doyon utility waste to energy plant, and the other half gets destroyed by our flare. So we're basically going to be doing the same thing with the evaporator, except that we're going to be using the methane that's from the gas that we're collecting to fuel the evaporator, which will evaporate a large portion of the leachate that's being generated or that we're having to haul. And so basically, so the impact from the flaring part isn't going to change. Where you're going to get the real greenhouse gas reduction is getting, you know, 2,000 round trips of, you know, a diesel tractor that gets 2.5 miles per gallon off of the road. And so that's where you're going to get the real reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, odors are a big deal to us. I don't want to go into it too much right now, but we're currently, you know, negotiating with the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation on a couple of notices of violation that are related to our air quality permit, of which one of those, you know, one portion of that NOV is related to odors. We've made significant investments in our landfill gas collection and control system over the past, you know, 2 or 3 years. I don't think up until actually earlier this week, we had one odor complaint for the past year. So we've kind of doubled down on the way that we're managing and the amount of money and effort that we're putting into our landfill gas collection and control system to reduce the odors that, you know, have been emanating from the site. And I think it's going to take a while, you know, just because the odors from that site have, you know, impacted a lot of people for a lot of years. But I think as time goes on, as we manage the collection and control system a lot better than we have in the past, we're going to see those odor complaints go down, as they obviously have, and hopefully, you know, change people's perception of you know, what happens when they drive past the landfill. Sorry to answer your question, Crystal. We're, like I said, we're starting the design process next week, and obviously odor control from those units is going to be a big part of, it's going to be one of the main design criteria that we have.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, that helps answer the question. And I'm glad to hear about the fact that you'll be kind of targeting that particular problem, because I want you to know, even if you're not getting the complaints, the problem still exists. I think people have kind of resigned themselves to the fact that it's just, you know, kind of a naturally occurring issue. But I guarantee you that I drive by that in that area multiple times in a week, and most days, especially in the winter, it's noticeable. So anyway, thanks, Mark. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
You are welcome, Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for Alex and perhaps Mark, let's say that we are able to get some of these projects funded through a federal infrastructure bill because they are worthy and they are shovel ready. we still have this perhaps $26 million surplus in this particular fund. What kind of restrictions are there on how we could use this fund? So, for example, could you take a portion of this fund and put it into the general municipal trust, where it would, generate interest for the municipality forever? Are there other alternative uses for this, or does it have to be? Is it legally restricted to SWS capital projects?
Through the chair, our goal would be if in fact we are able to get. Because remember, we need $175 million, $174 million to do this, and this is the borrowing authority that we're asking for. If by some chance we were able to get federal grants for $174 million, then yeah, these resources would not be needed. But I think what we would most likely suggest is moving forward with this as proposed, and so that we can, as you've heard, that Mark can start working on these projects, and then, if monies become available, we would just borrow less money, and the outcome of that would be that rates would not go up as much as we would otherwise project, because we wouldn't have to borrow as much money.
Can I ask a quick follow-up to that, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely.
So I that all makes good sense to me, and this is again in a world where we might be able to get things funded with a federal grant. But it does occur to me. I mean, I appreciate that you are improving the bond rating at SWS and you're using it to leverage other funds or to go into the market and borrow. But my understanding right now is that the return on the municipal trust is pretty high and the cost of borrowing is quite low. And so I do sort of wonder where those lines cross, I should say, where it makes more financial sense for us to invest this in something that generates revenue, and rely more on borrowing for these kind of projects. And I wonder if Mr. Slivka.
Okay. I guess the trade-off would be that right now, solid waste has functionally next to zero in terms of cash. I mean, it's a function of the fact that they had no rate increases for well over 10 years, and we've only recently started this path of raising rates, and we're on this path because we needed to borrow money in order to complete these projects. With this proposal, we're bringing forth additional projects. I guess I would say that yes, we can borrow money at something less than 4.5%, which is the statutory payout for the MOA trust. But on the other hand, if we end up borrowing large amounts of money, what happens is ratepayers of solid waste end up subsidizing general government as opposed to having their rates go directly toward reducing their costs. So I can appreciate the idea. We would suggest that keeping this money within solid waste to allow them to make these critical upgrades is actually the best use of money, even with thinking about what the differential is between borrowing versus earning. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there and say that, I believe we need to protect the ratepayers' interest in this, that money comes from the ratepayers, not from the taxpayers, and that money should stay with the utility that the ratepayers are supporting in one way or the other. If there are investment vehicles that the utility can take advantage of, that might be a conversation worth exploring at some time. But I just don't believe it's wise to contemplate either going down the road of expending utility ratepayer funds for municipal interests or municipal funds for ratepayer interests. I think we've been trying to clean that issue up, has been seen in the conversation related to fire hydrants and other methods with solid waste, or with AWW, and so those clean, bright lines are good for us, I would offer. Anyhow, Ms. Zalatoris.
Can I offer one other
Sure.
comment to remember is that this closure post-closure fund has had an average return over the last 2 years of 15%, which of course we've had great markets. And even though it's functionally 50% equity, 50% fixed income, it's had great returns. And the best estimate of the return over the next 30 odd years, which is this fund has a life of well over 40 years, is about 6%. So the money that stays in solid waste is being invested at rates equal to or higher to what the MOA trust would pay out. So we're being thoughtful about the funds that stay within solid waste.
Okay, so Ms. Salatil.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So kind of in the same vein, we've made some pretty big appropriations to solid waste in recent memory to carry out the master plan. Can you orient us kind of at what percentage we are as complete in the master plan, climate action plan? As we look at this next item, I almost need like a barometer or something that we're filling up to get through the plan, just so I can keep track of where we're at in all of the different steps.
Mark?
Yeah, to answer your question, I mean, the largest component of the financing that's associated with the master plan is from the central transfer station. So if you look at it on a basis of, weighting it on the total cost of the project, I mean, 115 million of that 165 million is associated with the completion of the transfer station, which will be done with that, keeping my fingers crossed, early 2023. We need to get the evaporator project done, just based off of what I said and the need from AWU ASAP. So design will be started this year. Hopefully we can finish up design by, sometime the end of this year, early next year, and start construction at some point in 2022, be finished by 2023. And then looking at that, what you have after that point is just the remaining 2 cells that are remaining to be constructed at the Anchorage Regional Landfill, which, depending on how fast we fill up the landfill, of course, those could be done within the next 5 to 10 years. So I would say within the next 5 years, the majority of our large capital, or those capital projects that we talked about, which were, asking for that increase in that borrowing authority, are going to be completed. If that answers your question, Meg.
Can I just follow up really quickly, Mr. Chair?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks. So if I understand correctly, I mean, we're ticking off the capital projects here in the master plan. We have outstanding then the issue of the cells and potentially waste to energy if we move that further forward. But otherwise, the master plan is pretty much, in terms of capital projects, almost complete.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right. Other questions from members? I'm not hearing any. Do you have any more for the presentation, Mr. Spafford?
Yes, I do. We just have a few more slides on utility rates. We just want to update you really briefly on that. And I'll have Heidi take over and just give a brief update to the body on that.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we thought that one of the main questions from this committee would be what are going to happen to the utility rates based on this increased debt and moving the 26 million. So we just put a couple of slides in here to explain to you. The very next one I'm going to show you will be a slide showing the lag in solid waste services rates, which Mr. Sloveka has pointed out. And then there's one past that will show our rates as compared to the consumer price index. Just for a little context, we are not trying to keep up with the other utilities, nor are we trying to keep up with the consumer price index or CPI. We're just trying to give kind of a visual picture. So here you have before you the rates for the last 10 years from the other municipal utilities as compared to solid waste. And as has been mentioned prior in this presentation, solid waste has not had rate increases for many, many years. And then in the past, the way it was done was just a great big increase all at once and then back to nothing, which I would imagine would be hard on any customer's pocketbook. So we are trying to keep steady rate increases. We did mention that in our financial plan that we presented back in 2018, that's starting in 2019. And for the foreseeable future, we would have a 6.25% rate increase for the disposal utility. And the next slide, you see the Consumer Price Index. What it has done since 1990 is the gray line there and projected on through 2026. And you can see what has happened with the solid waste disposal rates in relation to that price index, as we've gone many years with no rate increase, then a big increase, then years with no increase. We're trying to just steadily increase them. And it does feel like 6.25 is quite a bit, but as you look at it, we are still anticipate staying well below that consumer price index. But as I said, we're not trying to chase it or anything like that. We just think it's a good visual to consider. The other thing that we looked at in adding these additional projects and the additional financing is what would it do to our rates if we just did all of this and had to maintain our goals of cash on hand. As was previously mentioned, we need to have an amount of cash on hand. We need to have equity in the utility for a solid and healthy financial picture. If we were unable to pull the $26 million out of the ARL fund, we would have to finance more capital projects in order to meet those goals. We're not saying we're taking the whole $26 million and throwing it into capital projects. As Mr. Slavecka mentioned, we are planning to hold some of that in our cash pool to allow solid waste to have cash on hand. We're planning to hold some as equity just to make a healthy financial utility. But if we're not able to do that, we had to just run out and find another $26 million in financing to keep our capital program going, to make sure we have cash on hand and not spend the cash we have, that type of thing. The yellow line we added there would be the assumed debt service on financing, another $26 million, which would wreak havoc on our rates. So the thing we want to point out is that we're going to work very hard to maintain no more than the 6.25 rate increase for the foreseeable future, as we've previously told the Assembly and this committee. And we believe we can do that with the 3 proposals that you have before you, or will have before you. And we'll maintain that 6.25 rate increase. I've heard conversation here about additional grants, and appreciate what Mr. Slavecka said, that should we find other sources of funding and we're able to keep those rate increases below 6.25, that would excite all of us. But we are telling you that if those things don't come to fruition and we're able to follow what we're putting before you, we will still maintain our 6.25 rate increases. I believe that's my last slide. Am I correct? Unless there are questions on our rates.
Yep, correct, Heidi.
Thank you.
So this is Alex again. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this section because you haven't seen this yet, and I would just roll. Mark, you want to keep rolling through the slides? I do want to, yeah, right here. So I do want to, just as a highlight, we're asking for a borrowing authority of $174.4 million. You have previously given us authority for State of Alaska loans in the amount of $11,700,000, and as well as the use of equity and in the amount of $8.6 million. We're going to leave those in place just in case they become the most efficient way to fund these programs. Mark has said that as of today, solid waste is unable to access the clean loans because of our ongoing discussions with them, which is why we're using the capital markets for these projects. Mark, do you want to flip all the way to the end? So what's going to happen next is we're going to put these ordinances and resolutions into on base. You'll see them in the addendum for introduction on the 23rd. and public hearing on the 13th. And we are, of course, available to answer any and all questions. And I will stop there.
All right, are there any other questions from the members? I'm not hearing any. So with that, I think the next item on our agenda is a very brief stormwater utility update. Thank you, Mr. Spafford, for your time.
Yep. No, thank you very much, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
So, Mr. Corsentino, you or your team want to make a brief briefing on what we discussed yesterday and anything else?
Yeah, through the chair. Thank you. What I said yesterday, I sent an email to Chris and Meg, just letting him know there's the letter that was proposed from the Stormwater Utility Commission Advisory Board, recommending some changes. Will be moved forward to the Assembly in short order, I believe. And you'll see that. The other thing is the project is moving along. The contract's executed and we're starting the initial task order, which is to provide the detailed project schedule and public involvement plan, which will be shared with the Stormwater Utility Advisory Commission as well. And so it's moving. It's that's as much as I have now, but if there's other questions, I can be happy to answer that.
Any questions on that topic?
Yeah, Chris, sorry, I'm fumbling for my chat.
Go ahead.
Can I speak?
Go ahead, John.
Yeah, so Mark, can you refresh the memory on some of the dates then? So you have the schedule on public involvement plan. Do you have an expected date on when the first meeting on that would be, or presentation or something?
Yeah, you kind of broke up, but I think what I heard you say is, do I have an update on when we would expect kind of the first public involvement outreach to occur? Is that what I heard you say, John?
Yeah, thanks. I'll mumble louder next time.
We're working on an overall detailed project schedule, but the schedule for this project is around a 12-month. So I'd imagine in short order we'd have that. There's a few things to work out with the COVID ongoing pandemic and what assumptions we are going to put into place there. And it's kind of a moving target, obviously, with whether or not the emergency order is going to end or not and what criteria we should use. But right now, I think we're going to the assumption it'll be a blend of mostly teams still, but that could change. So honestly, I don't have a clear answer. I can get that to you. Let me talk to my team to figure that out. I don't have that, and it's going to go to the commission first. But I mean, overall, when you look at the whole thing's about a 12-month schedule, it's the first thing that's going to come out. So part of that discussion will also be what can we tell folks right away, and what message we want to convey right away. And that's why we want the commission to weigh in on that and make sure it's appropriate. So this first part is really the hardest in my mind in some respects, because we're really trying to figure out what we want to convey to the community right away before we have new information to share. And then once, obviously we get all the information and get past this first start, then I think it'll hopefully go a lot smoother. But it's really this first part that, in my mind is really important, is what message you want to get out to the community right away. And we'll use the commission to really get feedback from them on that. And that's being worked on now.
Yeah, that's fine. If you had a date, it'd be helpful, but that sounds like an appropriate process. Thanks.
And I would jump in there, John. The email communication between Mark and myself related to a number of changes to the underlying code section that authorizes the stormwater utility, which puts some more structure on the membership and creates, I think, a more representative board. And it was approved unanimously by the current membership of the Stormwater Utility Board. And I'm waiting for a communication from them, at which point I believe for next month's meeting, we would put that on the agenda in the context of either a draft ordinance or just a conversation, depending how far we make it. So I think that would be the time that I would ask Mr. Corsentino and the Stormwater Utility to present to us a brief preliminary timeline for the public outreach conversation.
Fair enough.
Does that seem reasonable, John?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, very good. Other questions? Okay, then briefly, I'm going to turn to, do we have legislative priorities to discuss? I understand we have port issues going up before the state in the conversation about a general obligation bond. And are there other items that we need to add to that list this time? or budget items outside of legislative priorities? I don't have anything to add at this time. So then next we'll pivot to audience participation.
Hello.
Hi there, Mr. Haberman. You're recognized for 3 minutes.
Okay, start my timer. My name is Eugene Carl Haberman. I'm known as Self Point and Government Watchdog. One thing I like to say is this. I'm more and more impressed in how more in your work you do in this, and administration does in handling issues affecting the state of Anchorage versus what the borough is doing out here. This week I heard this presentation dealing with solid waste and how you're handling it. And out in the borough, and remember, you're getting solid waste from the borough to handle, which was not addressed, and it should be addressed, and what the costs are and so forth. But the fact is that they're back to square one, back to zero, because they passed a resolution that said, a resolution of the City Borough Assembly endorsing septic treatment facility feasibility study to include evaluation of the City of Palmer's wastewater treatment plant for septic disposal, suspending application for construction funding of a septic treatment facility until the feasibility study is complete and the Assembly decides to proceed. They're back to square one. And I'd like to remind you, when they reference Palmer, the feds have been on top of them legally and problems there and how they're handling septic. So what we got here is the two largest areas in the state, populated areas in the state. Anchorage is first. Valley comes close second with as far as over 100,000 people. But they're handling septic in a way that, what are you going to do with it? Take it to Anchorage, and you're trying to deal with your issues. I think there should be more and more thought in this thing. A regional issue of dealing with septic as a region. Like, I remind you, out in the north, in New York, so 3 states that deal with tri-state and deal with transportation. I think you need to address that issue as a region, and not walk away from it. Though I would do it with caution, because there's clear mismanagement and clear lack of professionalism out here, and you are dealing with issues that need to be included with what the Valley is doing, because they're alone, and the ones who are involved with it are doing a very, very poor job. And the end result is the sewage is coming to Anchorage, and you're going to be handling it. So why not bridge the whole thing together and deal with it as a whole? And in closing, I remind you that should be brought out is that $1 billion price tag for Anchorage on septic that was not brought out. It needs to be brought out, that issue, because this is a temporary situation to a price tag that you're going to have to deal with to get to a better treatment dealing with sewage. And thank you very much. My time is up, and I wish you all the best.
All right. Is there anyone else from the public wishing to be heard? Okay, hearing nobody, we'll move on. I have one last thing. I try to do this now everywhere that I go. I'm going to put into the chat 2 links. The first one is to what I believe is the very first open vaccination clinic in the United States of America. And that would be tomorrow from 2 to 8 p.m. at the Dempsey Anderson Ice Arena, 1741 West Northern Lights. No appointment needed, 16 years or older eligible. If you haven't been vaccinated and you want to, and you don't have an appointment, drive there and you will be able to. Furthermore, I'm putting in the link to the Anchorage COVID vaccine site, and it has scores of appointments available if you're interested. So to all members of the public, it is highly recommended, so that we can get this economy booming again, that you get a vaccine and you do your part. So there's the link. And anything else?
Mr. Chairman, this is Pete.
Mr. Peterson, you're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to let the members know that they're putting together a list of projects for the Build Back Better infrastructure bill. And I put in $175 million request for the port. Jason, Mr. Blockenstadt had given me that number that they would need to work the next phase after we finish the cement petroleum terminal. And so I did submit that on. There's probably another 10 or 12 other items that are on that list so far. And that's just the initial list. There'll probably be a secondary list of projects that will be put together for that bill. And this, we don't know exactly how soon that bill is going to be working its way through Congress. But I just wanted to let you know that I did submit a $175 million request. Thank you.
Mr. Peterson, to whom was that submitted?
Oh, it was a group of stakeholders across this state that Ivy Sponholz, Representative Ivy Sponholz, had reached out to people and was putting a list of projects together.
Okay, very good. Thank you. I would appreciate if you can email me whatever you sent forward, just so I have it, because I'm having these conversations from here to DC and back.
Okay.
Make sure we're on the same page. Anything else? I guess on that note, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Thank you. Everyone have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.